Okay, so I'm going to just give a very, very brief preamble, and then we'll go into opening remarks by our panelists. Just quick introduction. My name is Nick Lemann. I'm a journalist and journalism school professor. Janet Gornick of CUNY Graduate Center is a distinguished scholar of social policy with a special interest in income inequality. She directs the Luxembourg Center at CUNY. Michael Kramer is one of the great veteran political journalists of New York Magazine, Time Magazine, and other venues for many years. When there's a presidential election, there is a pretty powerful tendency in the press and somewhat in the public to say, you know, it's really helpful to understand this as a contest between people, which of course it is, and to pay rather less attention to the issues in the election. I think objectively people are probably more interesting than issues, maybe not to weirdos like us, but to most people it's just fun to watch the characters unfold. But also, you know, there's a tendency, I think, to misunderstand how much is at stake in presidential elections in the policy sense, that is beyond who wins. We have a weirdly stable political party system whose demise everybody's always predicting, but it never quite happens. You have these two gigantic organizations, each one very durable, very big and complicated. Each is a shifting collection of interest groups that don't always agree. And inside each party apparatus are people who spend their lives thinking about advocating for policy change. The candidates most of the time are to the center of their party. So what you don't see, even if you go walk through the halls of the White House, and people are being fairly honest, you know, most people in the Republican administration are way to the right of where the public thinks the president is, and most people in Democratic administration are to the left of where most people think the president is. So there are these ideas sort of bubbling up in political magazines and think tanks, in universities, around all these issues, and they're not kind of on your radar screen maybe now, but they do, you know, the rubber meets the road after Inauguration Day. So we really want to give you some preview of things that, you know, could happen, should happen, might happen after the election. And I just urge you to be careful of the impulse, if it ever strikes you, to think whoever the two major party nominees, they're indistinguishable, they're just a bunch of clowns, they're just a bunch of politicians, you know, there's no real difference between them. That's not true. Also, we're in the early days of this. The purloined letter of American politics that's hiding in plain sight is what politicians actually say they're going to do. To a surprising extent that's very counterintuitive to political cynics, politicians do what they say they're going to do. They really do. Politicians make these major policy addresses during the campaign, just starting to do that. Bush just made one, Clinton just made one. Reporters and maybe other people, when you go in the newsroom and say, there's going to be a major policy address, at least when I was coming up in the world, the editor said, oh, God, me go. My eyes glaze over. Let's not cover it. Well, then if you go back and look, that stuff happens. So handle, you know, ignore this stuff at your peril. Even at this early stage, we can sort of tease out strands that quite possibly will become reality in a very short time, particularly on the Democratic side where there's such a clear front runner. What are they? You can only find out by listening to our panelists. Janet, take it away.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me begin with just a few general comments about the question that has been posed to us, and then I'm going to jump right in and say what I think it is that we're going to hear a lot about. I have to say that I'm a social scientist. I do a lot of work using data and very conventional methods. I'm crunching numbers and looking at things with certainty. So one can only imagine how uncomfortable I am being asked what's going to happen next year, because it just is not, there are no available methods really. There are few available methods. What is going to come to the surface during the campaign? I mean, this is sort of obvious, but I was scratching my head over this in the last few days. Obviously, what the candidates will say. I think I would disagree with you, Nick, only to this extent. I'm going to get there in a moment. I've spent a lot of time on the campaign websites in recent days. They could never possibly do everything because their platforms it would take 300 years to accomplish. I must say on Hillary's side, the 57 things that she's going to do, many of which I applaud, I have to say, would take many generations. So the question is, which of these will bubble forward? It will depend on what the candidates say. It will depend on what their opponents pick up on the media, on public opinion, which sadly plays less and less of a role. On focusing events, I think that's much more much more common in foreign policy. That's what we policy wonks call something that happens right sort of externally that then shifts the discussion. And then of course these endless gotcha moments that take place during campaigns. I was thinking through 2008. You didn't build that, and Ann Romney didn't work a day in her life, and I have binders full of women. These things that come out, and then for 3 days we're talking about infrastructure or supports for care at home and so forth. Those usually vanish, but then the 47% took hold, and many people think it really held. So we don't really know. There will be many things. I'm looking a little bit in the future based on then a somewhat unscientific toolkit, participant observation. I have been working in social policy for 35 years, including 6 years during the Reagan administration in Washington. Been teaching social policy and theories of the policy process for 20 years and listening to many, many students along the way. And I'm a junkie of TV news talk shows at my peril. That's why I know anything about public opinion outside Manhattan. And I'm happy to say that the candidates call me for research at times, and I don't think I'm breaking any state secrets to say I've heard 4 times now from the Clinton campaign. I'm waiting for Jeb's campaign to call me. I hope that's going to be soon. But they've called twice to talk about inequality at length, and twice about paid family leave. And the questions are about very detailed questions about the workings of policy, and I find that very encouraging. So I know time is tight here. I spent a lot of time on Hillary's website in the last days in anticipation of today, and I say that I don't know that if she will be the candidate. I think the odds seem to suggest that she will be. But even if she's not, I mean, I think at this point, in 2015-16, the issues are sort of set. If she gets bumped for Biden, or I heard this morning talk about Gore on TV, I don't know how long that will last. I don't think it'll be all that different, with the exception of issues that are being pushed forward because of her gender. So I know we're going to get to all these, but let me just spit out a quick laundry list of what's on her site and what I think is going to bubble up. She has built her website, I'm talking about social policy, Michael's going to talk about foreign policy, around 2 big themes, building an economy for tomorrow and strengthening America's families. And there is indeed a laundry list of the sort of wish list for liberals, investing in infrastructure, tax relief for families, raising the minimum wage, making college affordable, providing quality child care, defending, is the verb, defending the Affordable Care Act, defending Social Security. I could go on for quite a while, but you sort of get the point. Equal pay for women, parental leave, sick pay, and then, of course, the small issues of immigration and criminal justice reform. So she'll be tired if she wins. But what I think, and on the Republican side, I have to say, without being, I don't mean to dismiss this, but on the social policy side, the proactive, the proactive forces are, of course, on the Democratic side, because if you're talking about social policy expansion and new programs, I think we know, obviously, that's more likely to come from one side. This is what I'm seeing on the Republican side on social issues, and I'm assuming Bush, Walker, Rubio, Kasich, somewhere in there. I'm kind of not assuming we're going to be looking at Trump in the general election. That was yesterday's discussion. They are talking about abortion. They've picked up on this Planned Parenthood funding, and the rhetoric is about babies. It's not about women, which is strategic. Religious liberty. They've lost on gay marriage for the most part, but there's this residual issue of religious liberty in commerce. Entitlement reform. I was astonished to see that 4 of the leading candidates, Bush, Christie, Graham, and Paul, and others, are calling for raising the retirement age to 70. I was saying this to Nick earlier. I was always taught in Political Science 101 that was a real no-no. How exactly that's going to be finessed, I'm not sure. Means testing at the top of Social Security, that's not a new idea. But raising the minimum wage, even Boehner is in favor of 70. Indexing benefits and in ways. So they're talking about some real entitlements scaling back, and the Democrats are ready, I think, to protect a few other things. So let me just a couple more sentences, and then we'll open it up, turn it over. This is what I think we are going to hear a lot about. I think the issues that are really going to stick for the, losing my notes here. I think that these are three themes we're going to hear a lot about that I think for all the reasons that I've said, I think these will have traction. Supporting workers. I think that we have a female candidate. We have a recovery that's underway that opens the door for expansion, but also one where we know the labor market recovery is very sticky. There's a lot of involuntary part-time work, wage stagnation, a lot of very problematic contingent working conditions. This interest in inequality, which is huge. And then a sort of old American narrative. If you play by the rules, you shouldn't get shafted. And we're hearing a lot more of this. And to some extent on both sides of the aisle, when people go to work, they should be paid fairly. There's been a new, anyway, I think minimum wage, we're gonna hear about the living wage, paid leave, absolutely at the top of her agenda. And there's some support from Republicans, and paid sick leave, 5 to 7 days of paid sick leave so you don't go to work sick. Supporting workers who work part-time and work at night and work on stable and unpredictable shifts. This is a big issue suddenly. I'm enlivened by that. And I just have to say that the New York Times has done a lot of coverage about this. The nail salon, some of you probably read this, a young woman who worked at 3 different Dunkin' Donuts part-time and died in her car, sleeping because she was poisoned while she was trying to take a nap between her shifts. A young woman, there was a big story in the New York Times, going to her job at Starbucks, hiring a child care worker, riding on the bus for 2 hours, showing up at work and being sent home because her shift had been canceled because the software of scheduling showed she wasn't needed. There's a new bill now in Congress called the Schedules at Work Act, protecting workers. I think you're going to hear about this because it's tying in with the second thing, inequality. We'll come back to that. What does that mean on the policy side? I think they're going to talk about universal pre-K and fair taxes and protecting entitlements. I think that this is going to be a big issue. I think the Republicans at their peril, is Ed Rollins here, are you listening to me? I think raising the retirement age is not going to be a winner, frankly. I think that that may sound fiscally prudent, but I think Hillary or the Democratic candidates are really going to be on this. And defending Obamacare, let's talk about repeal. We'll come back to that. I think the call for repeal is weakening. They feel, I think Nick was saying a lot of it. Republicans feel, some responsibility to continue to talk about repealing Obamacare, but I think the Democrats are going to fight on that. So this is what I think you're going to hear again on the social policy: supporting workers, reducing inequality, and protecting entitlements.
Quick follow-up. What does fair taxes mean?
Well, let's see. That's a good question. I mean, I think generally it means, is that me making those noises? No. Sorry. I think generally it means raising tax rates on earned income on the highest earners, and possibly raising the tax rate on capital. On income from capital. Okay. This was a big discussion, of course, during the Romney campaign when his tax records came out, and we learned that he paid 13%. He was paying 1/6 of the effective tax rate of most middle-class people, and those were the two issues. It was the very low rate of taxation on capital, and I think some would argue a too low rate of taxation on the highest earners of earned income.
Okay, and I'll come back to that if we have time in a minute. But now, Michael. Tell us about foreign policy.
Well, first let me say this. You're right. I mean, the third rail in politics has always been entitlement reform. We'll see whether it changes this time. And I want to add one thing to what Nick said about essentially the way the world in political campaigning really works. It is true that if you look at what they say, especially in big speeches, they tend to mean what they say. But it often is the case that cycle begins because we, as the journalists, go around screaming, when are you going to put some flesh on the bones? Give us some policy speeches. Then they're forced to, and then if they deviate from that, if they happen to be elected, we hit them, for not being consistent. So, I mean, we're often portrayed as the bad guys, the journalists, and often we are. But they do what they want.
Yeah. Well, that didn't sound that bad, what you just described journalists doing.
That isn't the worst of what we do. Let me say generally that in foreign policy, this year is no different in the sense that you will have significant speeches from candidates on all ends of the political spectrum that will seek to defend American exceptionalism and try to shy away, basically, from, in most cases, from anything that might imply in terms of serious military involvement around the world. That's because nobody really can get it right, and they can't figure out exactly where the American people stand on this. We had two panels that were interesting so far in the conference. At least they were interesting to me, maybe because I was the moderator of both of them. One was on Iran. One was on understanding Islamic extremism, which Chase Robinson was a member of. They were wonderful in the sense that I think they illuminated a lot of what's going on. But at the end of those sessions, we've been using these keypads to have people vote very often. Those were the only two sessions in which the needle changed. The question in the Iran session was, if you were a member of Congress, would you support the agreement, and if you were voting? Many more people decided after the discussion that they would.
Yeah.
And in the Islamic panel, more people favored not putting boots on the ground, going in and fighting ISIS. These are issues I would submit to you, and this is what's different about foreign policy in many respects, that where you find the campaigns having to dance very quickly. Some event will happen, and everybody will be asked, what are you going to do about it? Should we do anything about it? The most difficult thing for a candidate to say in the midst of the campaign is, I would do nothing. Especially in the United States. So even if they believe that, even if they think...
Yeah, that actually happened, if you remember, in '08 with
Yeah.
Obama and the Soviets invading Georgia.
Right.
Where he got up and said, I would do nothing, and then that was a whoops, then he had to say, no, actually I would do something.
But he wouldn't say what he would do. By the way, in that area, with Russia and China, you obviously have the potential for trouble, so to speak, coming from those nations that would cause the candidates, as well as the incumbent president, to say something, if not do something. What happens if there's further encroachment into Ukraine? What happens if the Russians decide, well, let's just have a little foray into Latvia, Estonia, or Lithuania, NATO countries? It's not only what do we do as a nation, but what do the candidates say they're going to do? Every candidate will invariably say he would do more than what Obama is actually going to do, right? Because that's what seems to distinguish you in that kind of a situation. We can't let this happen. God damn it, we're not gonna. And if I were president, I would blah, blah, blah. I mean, you're familiar with this. I'm not telling you something that's new or something that's not going to happen. But having said that, I would just highlight a few things and then make one big point about Clinton. One is Iran is going to continue as a significant issue in this campaign, because even if the agreement passes Congress and the president's veto is not overridden, then you have implementation. And then you have cheating or allegations of cheating or something wasn't done properly or they're not doing this or they're not doing that. And with Republican candidates almost universally saying, that's it, we've got to go back.
On day one.
Day one, by the way, I'm glad Nick brought it up. Day one is, you think Janet has a laundry list. All of these candidates have a far longer laundry list of the things they're going to do on day one. I'm going to rip up the Iran agreement. I'm going to do there aren't enough minutes in the day to do all of this on day one, and in fact, very few things get done on day one, except invariably some tinkering with, depending on which candidate wins, with the reproductive rights issues where executive orders are at stake, and sometimes they're changed willy-nilly by pen. So something will happen in Iran, you know that. Things will happen in ISIS big time. You can't pick up the paper today and see a story that agrees on where ISIS is. They're firmly in control of Ramadi or they're about to be driven out. We just don't know where that's going to play. We don't know where Assad and Syria are going to be as this comes along. But generally speaking, you will have the calmer, more moderate candidates saying, basically we'll do nothing. And the guy who claims he's going to go in there, or the woman who claims she's going to go in there and do something. it's foolish to even speculate on what those some things would be, but you know they're going to happen, and you know the effect that the calculation that'll be made. People like Ed Rollins, who's been around here in a lot of these sessions, go into their presidents like Reagan and say, if Reagan already hadn't thought it, Mr. President, you have to, move the Sixth Fleet to, from Bahrain into the Gulf and make that show of force, and you've got to do some flyovers, and maybe you should create the no-fly zone over eastern Syria, and da-da-da-da-da-da. That's what the candidates will call for, because it's not their responsibility to actually do it. China, I don't know, a lot of you are much more well-versed on China than I am. My time there was in the old days. But if they keep building islands in the Spratlys or in the South China Sea, you know what the Republicans do. We're going to send the fleet. Remember Quamoya Matsu? Is anybody old enough here? Right. Nixon and the 1960 campaign. You can hear it, right? The Spratly Islands. Anybody who doesn't know what the Spratly Islands are going to know very soon, okay? Because it's going to be a big part of the campaign. I'll come back and get to some specifics when Nick's asking or you're asking questions, but I want to say one thing. Overall, besides where do you stand on American exceptionalism, and we, the candidates, are all for it, the interesting thing to watch will be the degree to which the distance from the president that's adopted by Clinton or Biden, let's say, or any Democratic candidate, and the Republicans, that's kind of easier to see. But if you're of the view, some of you are of the view, that George W. Bush overreached, Barack Obama underreached, a lot of space in between, where do you line up on that continuum? And Hillary, assuming she's the nominee, is going to have to be walking a very fine line. I'm not even talking about Benghazi. I'm talking about all the policies that she was a part of or commented on. Now, she's already attempted to distance herself from these things, I'll remind you. In the whole, remember the dust-up over the red line in Syria, the president saying, you use chemical weapons, Assad, that's a red line. She has criticized that. She has in a very strong way, indicated that, and I don't know where Chase stands on this, but I'd like to know. She is one of the people who's of the view that because we didn't arm in a serious way this anti-Assad Syrian rebels, that created a vacuum that allowed ISIS to come in. That's a critique that the administration doesn't share, obviously, but she is a former Secretary of State shares. She says she made that argument inside the administration, but like a good soldier, saluted when it didn't go her way. Same thing with Egypt and the Arab Spring. So that's something, if you're interested in this stuff, it's going to be very interesting to watch and track. The degree to which a candidate who's associated with the incumbent administration feels it necessary to distance herself, in this case, or himself, if someone like Biden is the nominee, from the existing policy that they were a part of creating, right? And it'll be our job as journalists to say, but you were, didn't you? And they'll say, no, you have to read the secret email where I took a different position. And I'm not even going to get into the emails because you know they're not going away.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'll stop there and you go. Yeah.
Let me do a follow-up question with you, and I think you're going to question my premise here, but I'm going to try it anyway because
I've never done that.
Presenting foreign policy as more reactive to events. But at least in retrospect, I think I can identify a big idea around each of the last several presidents. The Reagan's big idea was a more aggressive conduct of the Cold War. George H.W.'s big idea was managing the end of the Cold War. Clinton's big idea was kind of the indispensable nation, a sort of liberal version of American hegemony, if you will, end of history and all that. With George W., it was the war on terror and all that. With Obama, what I would say is a kind of managing of the situation where the United States is obviously not able to think of itself as the one superpower. And that's all by way of queuing up. Do you see it possible now to say, in the Democratic case and in the Republican case, here's what the one big idea might be in the next administration?
Not really, and the reason I don't is because I think that the appetite for muscularity has receded, which is generally where the Republicans would be.
Right.
And the appetite for receding, while maybe real, is very hard to articulate because it goes against America as the indispensable nation. And I also want to add, Nick, that, you know, these speeches, and Bush just gave his major foreign policy speech the other day. Did you all
Quite hawkish.
hear about it? Read about it? Of course not. But
Well, you should read it per what I was saying
Yeah,
at the
we
beginning,
will.
because there's a lot in that speech.
yeah.
Um,
But, you know, this is an example of, it's a perfect example, by the way, of what it means to give one of those speeches and try to give a real life example that gives substance to the rhetoric. We need to do more to help the people fighting ISIS. We need more airstrikes, blah, 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 blah. All right, so. Then he talks about putting in forward observers. These are American boots on the ground, the beginning of it. He glides by it, but it's there. And you see a sense it didn't get any real reaction,
That's
at least
right.
not yet. But it was a major shift in policy. As some of you know who followed this war, if I'm on the ground and I see an ISIS truck back there where the tech guys are, you know, and I want an airstrike on it, I gotta call my regional commander in Arabic, right? He has to call Baghdad. Baghdad has to get in touch with Central Command. Central Command gives an order to the fleet, and some jets are scrambled from the Gulf, or from Turkey. So it's a mess. And the whole call for forward observers is finally one that some candidate is putting out there. But I think that's one of the problems, is that there are we all know, we're all very familiar with some of these really lofty
Although,
speeches.
let me just point out something to
Yeah.
push back a little. I mean, if you remember '92, the lesson we had all learned from covering presidential campaigns was any Democrat who ever said the word taxes would die instantly, like zap. And then Bill Clinton raised taxes and balanced the budget, and he didn't get that.
But I'm saying,
So I think let me just
but
pull
did he
this
talk
out.
about that before the election?
He
Did he say he would do that
well, you know,
before the
Clinton was a genius. I was
I'm
covering.
not saying anything, right?
Well, he was he was more genius than that. I was covering in '96. For a book, there was this whole fight over affirmative action, and he gave his big "Mend it, don't end it" speech, which was a terrific speech. The people who were in the room watching him, who wanted affirmative action to go away, left the room saying he agrees with us. And the people who wanted to save affirmative action left the room saying he agrees with us. So he had an uncanny ability to signal
That's true.
to people. So I just want to highlight this. We don't need to settle, and we need to go to audience response and questions. But you're saying, which I think is absolutely the rule of the moment, that sending American troops in harm's way abroad is super toxic. And everybody in politics knows that. That's a taboo. You're saying that messing around with the entitlement system is super toxic politically, and it's a taboo. And both of these are taboos for Republicans especially. And you know, George W., when he won in '04, if you remember, he got up the next day and kind of strode around the stage, said, "Got political capital, gonna spend it." Remember that? And he spent it on trying to
Social Security.
make Social Security into an individual retirement system, and he got wiped out. He also tried to do immigration reform in a way that would be the liberal position now, and he got wiped out. So these toxicities exist until they don't exist. So I'm just saying we could get surprised. With that, let's go to your questions and responses. Howard?
What you just mentioned it, I was going to ask about immigration as an issue.
Well,
Do we
yes.
build a fence or
Sure.
a wall or what?
Well, of course, it cuts across both.
I consider that
yeah.
domestic.
Yeah,
She
I would say,
considers
yeah, we
that
were talking about
foreign,
so I said
so-
that's yours. Well, of course, it is on the agenda. That I think probably will shape up to some extent, depending who the candidate is on the Republican side, because there clearly is. We know there are real differences there. I mean, we know what the argument is, and they're going to try to find some balance between border security and some sort of path for bringing undocumented workers out of the shadows. I think that they will do their best probably to not touch it simply because it's so problematic. But it's clearly on the agenda. It has been. It's become one of these iconic issues that keeps getting bumped and bumped to the future.
Well, because of the Latino vote as well.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Before-
go ahead.
Sorry. Before you go to the next one, can we ask you to talk a little bit about Nick is really an expert on education reform, which is clearly going to be a major.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, one word on immigration, one quick word on that, and then Kim, you're next.
Sorry, Kim.
On immigration, note in the Republican debate there was quite a lot of difference of opinion among the Republicans on immigration. So it'll be an issue throughout the Republican primary season. Doing, as Janet did, this incredibly close Talmudic parsing of Hillary Clinton's various statements and anodyne website, I detect her being willing to sort of get out a little bit ahead on immigration, with which would be considered a more soft or forgiving position. And as you said, a lot of this is about how you read the Latino vote. I mean, Karl Rove was obsessed with this issue, and that's why he and Bush did the failed 06 immigration reform, because he'd look at the numbers and say, essentially, our party is dead without the Latino vote, and so that's leaving aside the policy. That's the kind of wake up for Republicans. How quote tough can they afford to be without backing themselves into a political corner? And there's lots that could be said about that. On education, I think you're going to see a lot of fighting about education in this election, possibly, and possibly with consequences. Super quick version. Hillary Clinton, her first sort of national politics move in the 80s was being, an early advocate of the quote-unquote political reform or accountability movement, having a big fight with the teachers union in Arkansas over testing and accountability. So that's where she was. Obama, who didn't say much about education in his campaign, tilted very strongly toward the education reform, charter school, measurement kind of stuff, much to the displeasure of the teachers union. Doing this parsing of Hillary's website and so on, I see her tilting back a little ways, being sort of to the left or pro-teachers union side of Obama a little bit. We'll see how that plays out, but kind of leaving her ed reform roots. And then there's the whole issue of higher education, where at least two candidates, one of whom I think is about to drop out, Rick Perry and Scott Walker, have really gotten up and said the whole way public universities operate is all wrong and they need a total redo. Hillary just gave another major policy address on education where it would be like, bear me out on this, very, very pleasing words to a dean of a public university, because it was, government's gonna step in, we're gonna help, no more debt, or much less debt. So that's a fight to watch for. Higher ed, yes, the conventional wisdom is true. There's a few more Democrats than Republicans sitting in the huge higher ed system, and so, there are very different visions there that'll get played out. That's just a little bit. Kim?
This is for Janet. The Social Security Disability Fund is going to run out of money before the election. And Congress will have to vote very specifically to take money out of the general fund to fund it. does that have the potential of taking entitlements, which people don't want to talk about, and actually making it a very explicit discussion in the campaign?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, we've heard this forever about the insolvency of the fund, the whole fund for old age, survivor, and disability altogether. It's an issue, of course, you know, the left always claims it's more solvent, the right always less solvent. No, this issue, no, actually I don't. I think it's too arcane. I think it will move to the question of the fiscal solvency. I think the Democrat, I don't actually. I mean, I think we've had this discussion. There are lots and lots of predictions. If you look at the whole fund with the retirement together, it has more longevity. And you know, of course, while the Republicans, and I realize disability is a particular subset, they haven't touched that yet. They're talking about the retirement age. Of course, the Democrats are going to push back on raising the cap, right? You know, there's a cap on your Social Security contribution now at $117,000, which is extremely regressive. The removal of the cap or raising it would solve this disability funding problem in 5 minutes. And so I don't think it will go too far, and I think the Democrats would jump on it if it were raised.
More? Yes. Yes, I am.
Okay, this is Janet. Could you get more specific with respect? Could you get more specific with respect to entitlements? You've mentioned them, and what specific entitlements do you think could be some issues that a candidate could use to their benefit?
Well, I mean, I think the question is, of course we know there's a lot of, the entitlement spending is a large share of public spending. The question usually comes down to, in social insurance, the question usually comes down to fiscal solvency. Let me just remind you that in social policy talk, I think you all know this, we talk about social assistance versus social insurance. And social assistance is usually, these are the means-tested programs for low-income families and so forth. That debate has a whole tenor to it. It usually has to do with work incentives, for example. That was the welfare wars all through the 90s. The concern about cutting welfare was not about budgetary sustainability. It was about changing the behavior of low-wage people. But the social insurance programs that are contributory, which are basically old age, survivor, disability, Medicare, these programs, the argument is not about incentives or behavioral problems. It's about the fiscal solvency. And I think both parties, I mean, people are concerned for sure, but I think the Democrats are queued up with, you know, reforms that tinker, raising the cap, changing the way that inflation is measured and so forth, that don't require cutting either the retirement age or means testing at the top. So I don't mean to sound partisan on this. I think the Republicans are going to lose, frankly, on entitlement reform in the way that they're talking about it, because I think there are very solid mainstream Democratic responses to it. Now, Obamacare is another issue. Of course, an entitlement means, right, if you're eligible, you're entitled
That's
by law.
another thing that's going to happen on day
receive
one.
it. Right, day one. So just as we were sort of talking about this before, and I know we want to leave time for more questions, but so it's become a big part of the Republican narrative, obviously, that Obamacare is damaging, it's a job killer, it takes away people's choices, it's raising the inflation on healthcare costs and so forth. And we've heard about repeal. How many times did they try to repeal it? 57? Or that's Heinz ketchup, I forget, some big number. And of course then, you know, this enormous challenge that was dangerous to Obamacare that went to the courts and then got rebuffed on the subsidies. So the point is that, one question is, Nick and I were talking about this before, are the Republicans really going to go to the mat on Obamacare? I think not, because I don't think it's going to be a winner anymore. I think the steam is somewhat out of that balloon. The claim, you'll forgive me, I'm citing a little bit our colleague Paul Krugman, who's been saying, you know, he's been noting that the Republicans have actually been relatively quiet about Obamacare, except for the mandatory, I'm going to get rid of it. But they're slowing down and repeating it's a job killer because the numbers aren't showing that. It's raising health care inflation, is not showing that, and of course we know we have this large number of people.
That's a very good example of how external events influence things. We will have had another year's worth of experience with Obamacare by the time election season really gets heated, and depending on what the critique is at that point, they will either embrace or walk away from the outright repeal.
Because the clock has been ticking out. So just a thing or two, this last thing on this. Nick had asked me earlier, suppose they really were serious. What would they do? Now, the legal channels are somewhat blocked, but I don't think we're going to see outright repeal, and I don't see another program queued up. It's also, as everybody knows, I think it's quite a conservative piece of policy, Obamacare anyway. But I think there could be a movement on day one or day three to reverse the mandate and to cut the subsidies somehow. in any case, I think there will be some narrative around Obamacare, but I think, as you said, and just the last point on this, we've been talking about how foreign policy is affected by external events, the exogenous forces, as a kind of say, and I think that's more true, obviously. But it's also can happen on the domestic side with, for example, the jobs reports, which come out every month, and everybody knows 6 months before an election, it is said, political scientists say, it's not the unemployment rate, it's the rate of economic growth is an enormous predictor of who wins. And we remember that through the last one, the first Friday of every month, everybody was waiting for the jobs report. There's 2 more jobs more than we thought there would be. Obama's going to win. There were 3 jobs less than we thought there would be. The unemployment rate moved slightly. It's really the growth. And I think also public opinion on Obamacare is moving around in a way that I think wasn't anticipated. And same thing on the issue of workers' rights. 72% of Americans are supporting raising the minimum wage. It's hard to, it's getting harder and harder to, to take control of these positions.
Sir.
Yes. Question for Michael. Michael, from your experience and from your perspective now, what in general is the use to a candidate?
I don't think Frank doesn't need a microphone.
Internally, Mike.
What in general is the use to a candidate of extensive foreign affairs knowledge?
I'd probably punt this to Jim Hogue, but I don't, it doesn't seem to matter very much. What matters is that there is some core group of people around him who know what they're doing and can fashion some kind of campaign strategy that they can defend and actually own and know. I forgot to mention something that coming from anyone else would have been gigantic. You may recall that when Hillary took out after the president, for his general view of foreign policy, when he said, don't do stupid shit, right? That's exactly what he said. It was then, we massaged it to don't do stupid stuff. But he described that as his foreign policy, and she said, great nations need organizing principles,
Right.
and don't do stupid shit is not an organizing principle.
Except that it is.
And that was considered a real distancing and a mature statement based on her experience as Secretary of State. But I don't know, Jim, do you think it's actually required that a candidate himself have some serious?
Well, the record would suggest no.
Yeah, I mean, we've had 3.
Thank you, Jim.
We've had 3 two-term presidents in a row, none of whom had any foreign policy experience when they took office. And maybe you could say, well, that proves my point, but it's been a pretty long run. The other thing to say, there's a Democratic team, there's a Republican team on foreign policy. So if we really brought Jim up to the stage and said, give us 10 names of people who will, with 95% certainty, be in high foreign policy positions in the next Republican and Democratic election, he could do it like that. So in a certain way, the team is working, it's slumbering, the Republican team is sort of slumbering, but they're ready to activate. The president sort of sits on top of these people, so it's not as exclusively presidential.
One more point about this. The last time one of these guys became president, it was George H.W. Bush. At a very, very important and fortuitous time at the end of the Cold War, basically, when the Berlin Wall was coming down. And whether it was he himself, because of his years at UN, CIA, stuff like that, or smart, calm people around him like Jim Baker and Brent Scowcroft, primarily, the idea of not dancing on the Soviet grave was a real big deal. And I think that if somebody actually stepped back, it'd be a good book, David, actually, and said, what if some more bellicose president had said, we stuffed it to him. what would have happened?
Well,
I mean,
we
there
know.
are times when you actually
we
need to
have
be.
some of the answer to that because the people who lost that fight were Cheney and Wolfowitz.
That's true. And they came
then
back.
they got their day in
Right.
court, you know?
That's right.
Yes.
That's right.
Isn't that a reason to at least have a president who has some sense of what makes sense? I mean, when you think of what
The low bar.
George W. Bush did and went for the whole Cheney-Wolfowitz path of lies went against his father, without thinking about the experience, the knowledge that was there on Iraq. I think you need someone with an understanding, at least of history and how the world.
You know, Susan, let me interrupt you. Yes, obviously. But I'm not defending George W. because it's indefensible. But on the other hand, if you're a guy like him and you're populating your administration, right? You take Dick Cheney, who had been defense secretary under your father, Wolfowitz, who had been undersecretary under
Defense.
the first
Yeah.
Bush. I mean, on paper, these seem like really sober, competent people. Colin Powell. You know, I've often said what's the most important attribute in the president? And I think it's clearly judgment. Not intelligence, not experience, judgment. You know, you tell me where that comes from. Not a clue. You know it when you see it. Some guys have it, some guys don't. Some guys have it in some areas and not in others. But it's just judgment. These decisions, when they get to them, are really, really difficult. There's stuff on either side. Paul Krugman and whoever his analog is, and your guys on the other side. You know, they all have good arguments. Somebody makes a judgment. And that's what goes on in that office. And then in retrospect, we say he had good judgment, or he didn't.
But this again falls to the issue of journalism, and this is really my second question. We find that what people make decisions on, we're all discussing policies in this room, the importance of policy. And when George W. Bush went to be elected, the focus was, who do I want to have a beer with and sit down? George Bush W. was it was blatant that he had no sense of judgment from the entire life that he led before he ever became a presidential candidate.
Right. Let me just address this briefly, and then Barbara, you get the last question, then we got to go because we're at time. I think it's very, very, I'm not being defensive here, but I don't think. But I think in the internet age, it's very, very difficult even to answer the question of why didn't the press X? Because I guarantee you, there's something like 5 million people in America now who self-identify as journalists. That's everybody with a blog. Somewhere I can find somebody who says every possible thing there is to say. So just like as an example, there was this huge fight in 2008 where the Hillary people said the media were biased against Hillary and for Obama. You know, which I generally agree with, but it's really hard to pin down in a data sense because you have to say, who are you talking about exactly and what stories are you talking about exactly? And a lot of this argument, I don't know if you remember that, but it was like 60% about Chris Matthews, and it was true about Chris Matthews, and it was 20% about Tim Russert, and it was true about him, but that's not the media. So I'm skeptical that there is this, in the way past post-Walter Cronkite era, that there's this thing called the media that you can sort of pin down to the table and yell at them and get them to behave differently with measurable outcomes. So,
No, I just see that as a problem.
yeah, well, yeah, that's another, we didn't have a media panel this year, maybe.
We were going
Barbara,
to.
last question.
It's been my observation and concern that you get an untried president like Obama, whom I respect in so many ways, in foreign policy. He's arrayed against the CIA, the FBI, the generals, the FBI, CIA, and all of these people who are entrenched in their concerns and their agenda. And they say to him, listen, Mr. President, if you do this or you don't do this, you'll have blood on your hands. And I'm wondering how, even with judgment, even with intelligence, how do you combat this array of these trained people who have their own particular agendas?
Well, one of the ways you do it is you're the president. And that's real power. And they stand up and they salute. Now they'll leak to us, and we'll write all these stories that inside they're all this disagreement. But there are tons of examples.
Yeah, Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah, when presidents say.
And a negative example is the war in Iraq, by the way, because all the military people came to Bush and said, this isn't going to work, Mr. President, and he ignored them.
Hey, can you let Christine ask a
Yeah,
question?
Christine, well, okay, you get the last clip.
Stand up so we can hear.
What will it take for climate change to be anywhere on this agenda?
Which is a good question, because Bill Burns, you know, on Thursday at the opening session was asked, what of all these issues most worries you? And he said climate change.
I think that I would simply say, actually, we also talked about this earlier. One of the interesting questions always in policy analysis, I'm trying to keep my eyes here on the issues, is what gets pushed off the agenda. That's, you know, public policy, theories of the public policy process. That's what I'm teaching this fall. 101 is keeping things off the agenda. I think we will not hear very much about climate change or guns or investing in infrastructure. There are lots of things that are crucial. Of course, climate change is one of the most important issues around, but I don't think either party is ready to.
But what would it take?
Well,
What kind of event or development could make that?
4 more superstorm Sandys. I'll tell you what, when I live in Manhattan, I know lots of you do as well. When I saw cars floating on Wall Street, I thought, if that photograph of
That
cars
was a good thing.
floating in water, I thought, if this doesn't wake up the world, I don't know what will. If this doesn't wake up the world here, this power center, and I think there will be some very dramatic catastrophes. It's not going to come as quickly, you know, when 1 million Bangladeshis are underwater. I don't think we're going to hear that much about climate change. I don't think there's an appetite for it among the public. I think it's depressing to people, and I don't think either party is ready to take it on. I think investing in infrastructure, we're not going to hear. Hillary will talk about it. But I also think guns. I think they are just, I think that they've abdicated on all those topics for this election cycle.
We're over, so let's stop here. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.